On January 22, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant John George lay pressed into the damp earth west of Point Cruz, Guadalcanal, staring through a piece of glass most of his superiors considered a joke. The Lyman Alaskan scope atop his Winchester Model 70 filled his vision with a narrow band of jungle, coconut trunks, shredded fronds, splintered stumps, and the dark, motionless shadows where death had been hiding for 3 days. Somewhere inside that tangle, Japanese snipers had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. Medics had dragged out the bodies one by one. No one had seen the shooters. The official answer, repeated up and down the 132nd Infantry Regiment, was simple: keep heads down, pour on more fire, let the artillery handle it. The unofficial answer, whispered in foxholes, was harsher. Men began avoiding certain paths. Runners took long detours. Platoon leaders stepped a little slower, knowing the enemy was hunting officers and sergeants first. George had watched it all while cradling a rifle the Army had never issued him. It was a civilian hunting piece, a pre-war Winchester Model 70 in .3006 with a smooth bolt and a deep-blued barrel. He had paid for it with 2 years of National Guard pay, ordering it through the mail long before Pearl Harbor. To him it was a precision instrument. To many regular officers it was a toy, a mail-order sweetheart unsuited to modern war. A company commander had tried to bar him from carrying it in the field, insisting that a proper combat officer used an M1 Garand or a carbine like everyone else. But now, in the ruined groves around Point Cruz, the standard answers were failing. The semi-automatic Garand spat fire bravely into the tree-line, yet the unseen Japanese marksmen answered with single, careful shots that found their targets with terrifying regularity. The snipers' positions were so well concealed that even after a man fell, no one could say where the bullet had come from. Behind George, the shattered remains of a plantation ran down toward the sea. Ahead, the ground rose gently into a maze of trees and kunai grass where the Imperial Japanese Army clung to its last defensive lines on Guadalcanal's northwestern coast. The air smelled of salt, rotting vegetation, and the faint copper tang of old blood. Occasional artillery thumps from both sides rolled across the canopy. Guadalcanal itself was no longer the unknown name it had been when U.S. Marines first landed in August 1942. After 6 months of grinding combat, the island had become a symbol. For Japan, it was the last serious attempt to dominate the southern Pacific and threaten the sea route between America and Australia. For the United States, it was the first sustained ground campaign against the empire that had struck at Pearl Harbor. By January 1943, the strategic tide had already turned. Midway lay 7 months in the past. Japanese naval power had been badly mauled. Yet on the ground, victory was still measured in yards of jungle and in the number of rifles left standing when a day's fighting ended. At Point Cruz, a handful of well-placed enemy snipers threatened to stall an entire battalion. George understood that snipers like these did more than inflict casualties. They froze movement, silenced initiative, and corroded morale. A single rifleman in a tree with a clear field of fire could pin down a company. 4 or 5, well hidden and patient, could make a whole front feel haunted. He also believed, from years of competitive shooting and hunting before the war, that there was another way to fight them, one the manuals barely mentioned. The Army's doctrine favored volume of fire, the rapid semi-automatic capabilities of the M1, and massed firepower over individual precision. To George, that made sense on an open battlefield. Against invisible marksmen in dense jungle, it meant little more than spraying fear at the trees. Now, as sweat trickled down his back and insects whined around his face, he inched the crosshairs of his mail-order scope across a tangle of branches 70, then 100, then 200 yards away. Through the glass he saw details his naked eye would have missed: a fresh chip on bark, an oddly straight line beneath a clump of leaves, a fragment of cloth that did not belong. For 3 days, the snipers had dictated the terms of the fight. On this 4th day, George intended to change that, with a rifle the United States Army had never intended to bring to war. The first shot came not from George, but from the unseen enemy who had owned the ground for days. Somewhere ahead, a flat, almost delicate crack broke the jungle's murmuring. A second later a bullet slapped into the earth a few yards to George's left, tossing up a puff of soil. An American runner who had been inching along the shallow trench dropped flat, hard hammering. No one saw the muzzle flash. They never did. George did not look toward the sound. He forced himself to stay still, letting the scope do his searching. The Lyman Alaskan was only 2.5 power, but through its circle of glass the world slowed and sharpened. He moved the crosshairs in tiny arcs, trunk by trunk, branch by branch, from about 150 yards out to nearly 300. Guadalcanal's January light was harsh and level. On bare bark it left hard shadows, and foliage it flattened color into a uniform gray. The Japanese snipers used that to vanish. They dug small hides into broken limbs, wrapped themselves in burlap or leaves, and cut thumb-sized loopholes in the lattice of branches. Many were expert enough to go an entire day without betraying a movement larger than a blink. George had been a hunter long before he was an officer. He knew that in country like this, sign mattered more than spectacle. A chip out of a coconut trunk at the wrong angle, a branch trimmed too cleanly, a darker rectangle where brush had been pulled together. Eventually, his wandering crosshairs stopped. On one tree about 200 yards out, a horizontal limb met the trunk in an oddly geometric way, as if someone had shaved and wedged the angles. Below it was a patch of blackness that did not quite match the surrounding shadows. The bark around it showed fresh scars, like small exits where bullets had slipped through. George exhaled and let half the breath stay gone. The Winchester's stock was familiar against his cheek, worn smooth by years of practice. He knew his rifle printed tight groups at 300 yards when he did his part. The M1S around him, magnificent for volume of fire, could not match that at this distance under field conditions. He squeezed. The report felt shockingly loud after the sniper's earlier, dainty crack. The rifle came back into his shoulder and settled quickly. Through the scope he saw the patch of darkness jerk, then collapse sideways in a tumble of leaves and debris. A limp arm, the unmistakable shape of a helmet, and then stillness. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, from off to the right, another enemy rifle barked, this time hasty, a fraction too high. The bullet snapped overhead. George slid backward, rolling into a new depression a few yards along the line. If he had learned one thing from both hunting and reading what little doctrine existed on sniping, it was this: never fire twice from the same spot when the opposition includes skilled marksmen. Within minutes, word ran down the company front that someone had finally hit one of the ghosts in the trees. Men who had been hugging the dirt began to crawl up just enough to see. A sergeant squinted through binoculars and confirmed the shape in the branches. That afternoon, patrols pushing cautiously forward found the body of a Japanese sniper lashed into a camouflaged perch, rifle still clutched, shot cleanly through the head. For George's battalion, the effect was greater than a single kill. It proved the snipers were not invincible spirits but mortal opponents who could be studied, understood, and beaten. More importantly, it suggested that precision fire from a carefully handled weapon could solve problems that massed semi-automatic volleys could not. The next morning, George was no longer simply an odd young officer with a sporting rifle. The battalion commander called him in, listened to his account of how he had located the hide, and asked him to repeat the performance. This time it was not phrased as a challenge but as a task. Officially, the U.S. Army in early 1943 had no widespread, standardized sniper program. A few units had experimenters, manuals mentioned marksmanship, but sniping was largely an afterthought. The Marines on Guadalcanal had already begun forming two-man teams with scoped .03 Springfields, yet on the Army side such efforts were patchy at best. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, made deliberate use of sniper-trained infantry to slow advances and pick off leaders. In the ruined groves west of Point Cruz, George was about to improvise his own answer. Over the next days he would refine a method, part stalking, part patient observation, part ruthless exploitation of the enemy's habits, that would claim 10 more Japanese snipers. And as the body count grew, so would something harder to measure, a change in how his comrades, and eventually his superiors, thought about what one skilled rifleman could do. By the third morning, the men of the 132nd Infantry no longer joked about John George's rifle. They watched for the glint of its scope the way sailors watch for a lighthouse. The battalion commander began assigning George specific sectors rather than routine platoon duties. Word came forward from the command post that any report of persistent sniper fire was to be relayed directly to him. It was an informal arrangement, no new table of organization, no special badge, but on that battered strip of coast, John George had become something the Army had not yet properly named: a dedicated countersniper. He moved methodically. Each day, just after dawn when the light strengthened but the heat had not yet turned murderous, he would crawl to a new hide along the forward edge of the American positions. Sometimes he worked alone. At other times he brought along a trusted enlisted man as a spotter, armed with field glasses and a standard rifle. Their job was to watch, wait, and piece together the habits of the enemy marksman. George learned quickly that the Japanese snipers were creatures of pattern. They tended to favor trees overlooking trails or gaps in the undergrowth, places where Americans had to stand or move to do their work. Many of the hides were not perfect single trees but clusters, with a primary firing perch and one or two backups a few meters away. The snipers sometimes shifted between them depending on the angle of the sun and the reaction of the Americans below. To expose those patterns, George did something that cut directly against the Army's instinctive response to danger. He asked for quiet. Instead of answering a sniper's shot with an immediate roar of return fire, he requested that nearby units hold their weapons unless absolutely necessary. Noise gave concealment to the enemy as much as to his own side. Silence, by contrast, turned every sound, a rustle, a click, a careless movement, into a clue. It also unsettled the Japanese, who were accustomed to the Americans blasting wildly at the trees after each casualty. So on that second and third day, when a hidden rifle cracked and a bullet snapped across the front, the usual eruptions of Garand fire grew shorter. Within minutes, the only regular sound was the soft buzz of insects and the distant thump of artillery. Behind this curtain of stillness, George lay prone, scope to eye, searching for the tiny disturbances that betrayed a sniper shifting his weight, easing a cramp, or adjusting his firing slit. He kept careful mental notes: approximate range, sector, height of probable perches. When a shot came, he would try to pin down not just its general direction but its vertical origin, low, midway, or high in the vegetation. Time of day mattered too. Some Japanese preferred the first light, others waited until hunger or fatigue made their targets careless in midday heat. Once he had enough fragments, he set the trap. On one afternoon, with the sun angling low over the sea, George deliberately exposed a small, tempting target, a helmet perched on a stick behind a patch of brush, with the bare rim just visible from the likely sniper arc. He and his observer then shifted 30 yards laterally into a shallow fold of ground, giving them a clear view of the trees that commanded that sector. The wait lasted nearly an hour. Finally, the Japanese rifle boomed. The helmet jerked, splinters flew. Through the Lyman scope, George saw what he had hoped for: a brief, unconscious relaxation in the shooter's hide, a tiny movement of satisfaction that momentarily broke the sniper's rigid discipline. A leaf quivered where no breeze touched it. The barrel shifted a fraction. George was already on him. The crosshairs found the darker notch in the foliage. The Winchester spoke. This time the fall was more dramatic, a body tumbling from a mid-level fork of a tree, striking lower branches on the way down before landing in the brush with an audible crash. American riflemen along the line, who had been holding their breath as much as their fire, let out a ragged cheer. One of the company commanders radioed back that the ghosts were dying off. George simply rechambered, scanned again, and then shifted position. He had learned enough respect for his opposite numbers to assume there might be a second or third rifleman nearby, waiting for exactly the kind of triumph-drunk carelessness he himself was now exploiting. By the end of the third day, his tally reached several confirmed kills. Platoons that had been pinned along certain draws and trails began to move more freely. Casualty reports from sniper fire dropped. None of this appeared yet in any official after-action summary. On paper, the battalion was simply continuing its westward push toward Cape Esperance. In reality, a thin, almost invisible duel was being decided in the treetops. What was happening around Point Cruz was more than a series of individual marksmanship contests. It was a quiet experiment in doctrine. George's work demonstrated, in the harshest possible laboratory, that one well-equipped, well-trained rifleman, given time, freedom of maneuver, and the right tool, could neutralize threats that entire platoons of semi-automatic rifles could not reliably touch. His commanders were starting to notice. The question now was whether this improvisation would remain a battlefield curiosity, or whether it would harden into a repeatable method that could be passed from one unit to another, before hundreds more men walked into the sights of hidden rifles on islands yet to be fought for. The answer would come with the fourth day, when George pushed his experiment to its limit against the last and most dangerous sniper nest on that haunted stretch of coast. By January 25, 1943, the fourth day of his private campaign, the sniper fire around Point Cruz had thinned, but it had not disappeared. Most of the obvious nests were gone. Patrols moving through the coconut groves now did so with helmets up instead of pressed to the dirt. Yet every few hours, a solitary, unnervingly accurate shot still rang out from the northwestern fringe of the battalion sector. Men were no longer dying in clusters, they were dying one at a time. George studied the pattern on the battalion situation map. The remaining casualties traced an arc along a shallow draw that funneled toward a narrow gap in the trees. Runners, stretcher-bearers, junior officers, all had to pass that choke point sooner or later. The sniper knew it, and he was patient. Late that morning, George and his chosen observer, a steady private named Lang, slipped forward before the sun climbed high. Instead of taking the same shallow trench routes as the rest of the line, they looped wide, crawling through scrub until they found a low mound that gave them a slantwise view of the danger area. George's method remained the same: silence, time, and glass. For nearly 2 hours they lay still, the jumble pressing down like a weight. Ants crawled across George's hands, sweat filled his eyes and dried again. Somewhere behind them, a machine gun team clattered briefly, then fell quiet. Overhead, a single American observation plane droned past. Then, just before noon, the enemy obliged. A rifle cracked, sharp, clipped, supremely confident. Down by the draw, a dust puff leapt from a shattered stump beside a moving figure. The American darted back, unhit but shocked. George ignored him. He and Lang were already tracking. The sound had come from left of the gap, roughly 250 yards out and perhaps 20 feet off the ground. But the Japanese sniper had learned as well. No carelessness, no visible flinch followed the shot. The foliage in that sector remained eerily still. Low in that banyan cluster, Lang whispered through clenched teeth, binoculars steady. Somewhere around the third fork. George adjusted the elevation drum on the Lyman scope and began the slow, deliberate sweep he had repeated so many times. This time, however, the battlefield seemed to conspire against him. The angle of the sun, the density of leaves, the chaotic crisscross of branches, all hid rather than revealed. After 15 minutes, sweat soaking his shirt, he made a decision that violated one of his own rules. He would have to provoke the man. He and Lang backed down the mound and circled again, this time pushing a few yards closer to the draw under cover of a shallow ravine. There they rigged a different bait, not a helmet on a stick, but a short, jerky movement just visible above a fallen trunk, enough to suggest a man inching to a new position. To sell the illusion, George signaled a nearby squad. At his mark, they were to make a short, noisy dash across a patch of ground and then freeze. The idea was to convince the sniper that his opportunity came not once, but twice. The plan almost killed George. When the squad moved, the enemy fired, not at them, but at the faint glint of his own scope. The bullet struck the lip of earth inches above his head, spraying his face with grit. Instinct jerked him sideways, his heart pounded against the stock. The Japanese sniper, it seemed, had guessed that he was being hunted and was watching not the bait, but the area from which a counter-sniper might operate. For a long minute George lay still, ears ringing, convinced another round was coming. None did. The enemy had fired once and gone motionless again. Somewhere up in that curtain of branches, a man was now waiting, as wary of giving himself away as George was of peering too boldly. The duel had shifted from hunting to chess. George wiped his eyes, forced his breathing steady, and thought. The shot's impact told him something. The round had come from slightly higher than he'd guessed, a nest perhaps 30 feet up, not 20. And if the sniper had aimed at his scope reflection, then he was watching a very specific slice of ground. He slid backward, then crab-crawled along the ravine another 10 yards, changing his angle of view by what seemed a trivial amount. On the far side of the draw, that shift translated to several meters of lateral displacement, enough, he hoped, to give him a glimpse into the branches from a new perspective. Only then did he lift the Winchester again. Through the glass, the banyan cluster rearranged itself. Layers that had appeared as a solid wall now separated into distinct planes. On one mid-level branch, what had looked like a natural knot resolved into something slightly too round, too regular, a loop of burlap sandbag twisted around a limb to form a rifle rest. Just beyond it, where two branches crossed, lay a darkness that did not match the play of light elsewhere, a firing slit, cut into a screen of leaves. The sniper had chosen his hide well. From almost any other spot on the American line, the angles concealed him completely. From this one, narrow position, his deception frayed. George didn't wait. He steadied the crosshairs on the shadowed notch where forehead and eye would lie behind the leaves, exhaled, and pressed the trigger. The banyan seemed to shudder. Something inside the foliage convulsed and sagged against the trunk, then slowly peeled away, falling in stages through the lattice of branches to thud into the undergrowth below. Silence reclaimed the grove. No answering shot came from a backup perch. No flicker of movement betrayed another pair of hostile eyes. After several minutes of watching, George eased back and signaled the squad, advance with care, but advance. When they reached the base of the tree, they found what his scope had suggested, an expertly camouflaged nest, firing slit barely wider than a thumb, rifle still looped into its burlap rest. The dead sniper wore extra ammunition bandoliers and carried a small notebook of range sketches, evidence that he had been methodically hunting this sector for days. With his death, the last significant sniper threat in the battalion's area of operations vanished. Over 4 days, by the battalion commander's conservative count, George's mail-order rifle had accounted for 11 enemy marksmen. The number told one story. The change in how men moved, stood, and breathed on that part of Guadalcanal told another. The effect of those 4 days could not be captured in a single number, but the battalion tried. In the after-action reports filed once the Point Cruz sector had been cleared, staff officers estimated that Japanese sniper fire had caused more than a dozen deaths and numerous wounds before George's work began. In the 3 days after the last nest was neutralized, casualties from aimed rifle fire in his area dropped almost to zero. Patrols pushed through previously dreaded groves. Runners stopped detouring hundreds of yards around exposed stretches. Squad leaders stood up to point instead of gesturing from the ground. To the men on the line, the change felt like a lifted curse. There was no official medal ceremony. The campaign on Guadalcanal still raged. The Americal Division and the 25th Infantry were driving west toward Cocombona, where the remnants of the Japanese 17th Army clung stubbornly to ridge and ravine. In that press of operations, one lieutenant's success against 11 enemy sharpshooters might easily have vanished into the mass of reports. But the battalion commander understood what he had seen. He ordered George to write down, in plain language, exactly how he had found and killed each sniper. Positions, distances, angles of approach, how bait had been used, what mistakes the Japanese had made. A mimeographed summary circulated among company commanders as a lessons learned sheet, unofficial, but read with intense interest by officers whose men still faced similar threats on other parts of the line. From there, the ideas began to spread in the untidy, organic way of wartime innovation. A captain transferred to a sister regiment took a copy with him. An observer from division headquarters watched George work for a morning, then mentioned it in a briefing. Before long, other units on Guadalcanal were pairing good shots with field glasses and whatever scoped rifles they could scrounge, old M1903 Springfields, sporting guns shipped from home, even a few hastily modified Garins. Nothing about this was standardized, and yet a pattern was emerging: two-man teams, patient observation from concealed hides, deliberate counter-sniper hunting rather than blind return fire. In later years, U.S. Army historians would look back on these months as part of a broader, improvised birth of American sniper doctrine in the Pacific. For George himself, Point Cruz was not the end. After Guadalcanal, he would go on to serve in the jungles of Burma with Merrill's Marauders, again putting precision shooting and fieldcraft to use against a determined enemy. There, too, in the tangled ravines and ridges of northern Burma, he would see how a carefully placed shot from a bolt-action rifle could solve problems that no amount of automatic fire could. Yet the Winchester Model 70 that he had first carried onto Guadalcanal remained the emblem of his experiment. Technically, it should not have been there at all. It was not on any official list of approved weapons. It had entered the war through a loophole, personal initiative, lax early war enforcement, and a chain of commanders willing to look the other way once results became undeniable. The Army's own answer to the sniper problem, the M1903A4 with factory-mounted scope, would not appear in any numbers until later in 1943. Even then, supply lagged behind need, and training doctrine often trailed the realities of jungle combat. At a higher level, senior planners still tended to think of firepower in terms of machine guns, artillery, and mass. The notion that a single rifleman with a carefully chosen civilian weapon could influence the tempo of operations across a battalion front fit awkwardly with that worldview. On Guadalcanal, however, the proof lay in the daily casualty lists and the suddenly freer movement of companies that had once hugged the earth. In quiet moments after the fighting around Point Cruz, George jotted notes not only about techniques but about his rifle itself, its balance, its trigger, its reliability in heat and rain, the way its slower bolt action forced a kind of discipline. He knew that in the era of the M1 Garand, the Model 70 was an outlier. But he also suspected that its very unfashionable qualities, accuracy, consistency, the need for deliberate marksmanship, had made the difference. The men around him sensed it, too. Officers who had once mocked the mail-order sweetheart now asked to borrow it for a few shots, just to feel how it handled. Enlisted soldiers who had watched their friends fall to invisible enemies looked at the long-barreled Winchester with a mixture of gratitude and superstition. It had become, in their minds, less an oddity and more a talisman, proof that skill and patience could beat terror in the treetops. What George could not yet know was how far his experiences, and his meticulous notes, would travel after the war. For the moment, the lessons remained mostly in the heads of those who had survived Guadalcanal's coconut groves. Ahead lay new islands, new campaigns, and new generations of soldiers who would either rediscover these principles for themselves or learn them from those who had been there first. The bridge between those futures would be built not on the battlefield, but on paper. After Guadalcanal, the war rolled onward, and with it the men who had survived its steep learning curve. John George left the coconut groves for a different kind of jungle war. Transferred to the 5,307th Composite Unit, better known as Merrill's Marauders, he fought across northern Burma in 1944, leading small units through ridges, ravines, and bamboo thickets where visibility shrank to a few yards and ambush was a daily fact of life. Once again, he used careful marksmanship and fieldcraft to offset superior enemy numbers. Once again, his commanders leaned on his ability to see the battlefield through a rifleman's sights rather than through a staff officer's map. But the lessons first hardened around Point Cruz stayed with him most clearly. They were simple, almost brutally so. Precision outruns volume when the target is hidden and the stakes are measured in inches. A single motivated hunter, given time and the right tools, can unmake an enemy's plan as effectively as an artillery barrage. Silence and patience are weapons. And doctrine, no matter how polished in peacetime, is only a starting point. Real war demands improvisation. When the war ended and George returned to the United States, he carried those convictions home along with his decorations. Many veterans tried to leave their memories on distant shores. George did something different. He wrote. The result, published in 1947, was a thick volume titled Shots Fired in Anger. Part memoir, part technical manual, it chronicled his experiences on Guadalcanal and in Burma with a detail that few wartime accounts attempted. He described the mail-order Winchester Model 70, the Lyman Alaskan scope, and the four-day duel with Japanese snipers in language that blended story and instruction. He laid out, step by step, how he read the jungle, how he staged decoys, how he shifted positions after each shot, how he worked with observers. The book did not top bestseller lists. It was too uncompromising, too focused on the gritty realities of marksmanship. But among soldiers, Marines, and competitive shooters, it spread quietly from hand to hand. In the years that followed, as the Army and Marine Corps tried to turn wartime improvisations into formal sniper schools, instructors mined its pages for insights that were as relevant in Korea's hills and Vietnam's paddies as they had been on Guadalcanal. By the 1960s, the Winchester Model 70 that George had once smuggled into combat as an unofficial curiosity reappeared in a new guise. U.S. Marine Corps armorers selected the pre-1964 Model 70 as the basis for their first modern sniper rifles in Vietnam, mating it with high-quality scopes to create weapons capable of the same kind of deliberate, long-range work George had pioneered. Army doctrine, too, increasingly emphasized two-man sniper teams, patient observation, and carefully chosen shots, echoes of those early, unformalized lessons in the coconut groves. No single man, and no single rifle, invents a doctrine. Sniper tactics grew from many sources: British experience in 2 world wars, Soviet experiments on the Eastern Front, Marine initiatives in the Pacific, and countless unnamed soldiers who learned, often fatally, what worked and what did not. Yet John George's small, stubborn rebellion, a lieutenant insisting on carrying a civilian hunting rifle into a modern war, formed a distinct thread in that tapestry. The numbers attached to his 4 days west of Point Cruz remain, by necessity, estimates. A battalion staff officer later suggested that the removal of 11 Japanese snipers saved on the order of a couple thousand lives across subsequent operations, as counter-sniper techniques spread and enemy fire lost much of its terror. Whether the true figure was higher or lower hardly matters. The impact can be read instead in the way men walked, heads a little higher, routes a little straighter, decisions made without the constant fear of a bullet from an invisible perch. That is the quiet power of such stories. Grand strategy turns on fleets and factories, on prime ministers and emperors. But on the ground, wars are also shifted by individuals who refuse to accept that the way things are done is the limit of what can be achieved. A young National Guard officer ordering a rifle through the mail, paying for it with his own wages, and then carrying it into battle against expert snipers was not in any official plan for the Pacific War. Yet his determination to prove an idea in blood and mud altered how an army thought about the relationship between man and weapon. On the maps in Washington and Tokyo, Guadalcanal is a small, jagged shape in a vast ocean. In history's larger narrative, the 4 days when John George hunted snipers near Point Cruz might seem smaller still. But for the men who lived because those rifles in the trees finally fell silent, and for the generations of marksmen who later trained on principles forged there, the episode stands as a reminder. Sometimes, in the great machinery of global war, the hinge of change is not a new tank or a secret code. Sometimes it is a single mail-order rifle in the hands of someone who knows exactly what it can do, and is willing to prove it to everyone who doubts.